Frank. "No," cried Charlie. "Mom, Frank ate my hot dog." Moments later, our dog becomes ill. Someone was trying to make my son sick. But why? Hello, I'm Truly, and welcome to my channel. Thank you for listening, and I am curious. Where and what time are you hearing this story? Please, let me know where you are hearing this in the comments below. Lastly, for more stories, be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. The scream tore through the manufactured quiet of our Saturday afternoon, a siren song of adolescent outrage that always managed to snag my attention, no matter how engrossed I was in my own tasks. "Frank, no." Charlie's voice, usually a low rumble of disinterest, was high-pitched with panic. My heart did a familiar lurch, the proprietary pang of a mother's worry. Had Frank, our perpetually enthusiastic golden retriever, finally managed to ingest something truly catastrophic? I practically vaulted from my armchair, dropping the gardening book I'd been pretending to read. Mark, my husband, looked up from his laptop, a mild frown creasing his brow. "What is it, April?" Charlie was already by the back door, his face pale, eyes wide with a terror that went beyond a simple case of pilfered picnic fare. Frank, usually the picture of canine composure, was a whirlwind of golden fur and frantic panting. "Mom, Frank ate my hot dog." My initial instinct was exasperation, quickly followed by the familiar chore of dog parenting. "Charlie, honestly, did you leave it where he could reach it?" I started towards the door, already anticipating the cleanup. Frank had a notorious weakness for anything remotely edible, and Charlie's teenage carelessness wasn't exactly a myth. But as I reached the threshold, the scene that greeted me was far from the usual slobbery aftermath. Charlie stood frozen, his hot dog bun, minus its juicy contents, clutched in his hand like a relic. Frank, however, wasn't wagging his tail in victory or looking for a pat on the head. He was on his side, his usually bright eyes glazed, his breathing shallow and ragged. A small, unidentifiable lump was visible in his throat, a dark blemish against his golden fur. "Frank." I knelt beside him, my earlier annoyance dissolving into a cold dread. The dog whimpered, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. He wasn't just sick, he looked genuinely unwell, alarmingly so. Mark joined us, his earlier mildness replaced by a grim concern. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. He just ate it," Charlie stammered, gesturing with the bun. It was on the table. I turned around for a second, and he just swallowed it whole. It was so fast. I gently prodded Frank's side. He flinched, and I saw the tail ripple of something moving uncomfortably beneath his fur. It wasn't just a swallowed hot dog. It felt wrong. Too solid, too large. My mind, a chaotic jumble of maternal anxieties, latched onto a single, chilling thought. Someone had tried to make my son sick. The hot dog was the vehicle, but the intent was to harm Charlie. But how? And who? The question hung in the humid air, heavy and suffocating. And then, like a phantom limb, a familiar, unwelcome face swam into my consciousness. Zoe, my sister-in-law. Zoe, with her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and her perpetually disappointed smile. The woman who had always seemed to resent my very existence, my marriage to Mark, my son. Zoe's jealousy was a palpable thing, a low hum of animosity that had been present since the day Mark and I got engaged. She'd always subtly undermined me, planting seeds of doubt in Mark's mind about my mothering abilities, my career choices, my sanity. Her latest obsession, it seemed, was to prove me an unfit mother, a narrative she clearly intended to weave until Mark, finally fed up with my perceived failures, divorced me and she could swoop in, a comforting presence for her grieving brother. The thought of Zoe orchestrating something so sinister, so calculated, made my stomach clench. But the evidence, or rather the lack of it, was a chilling void. Frank had eaten the hot dog. Charlie had been there, but what if the hot dog itself was the problem? A poisoned hot dog? An improperly prepared one that could cause choking? "We need to get him to the vet now," I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Mark was already on his phone, his focus laser sharp. "I'll call the emergency clinic," he said, his fingers flying across the screen. "April. Keep an eye on him." As Mark made the call, I looked at Charlie. He was still staring at Frank, his face a mask of distress. He was a good kid, my Charlie. He adored Frank, and the thought of Frank suffering because of him was clearly tearing him apart. But the seed of doubt, planted by Zoe's constant insinuations, began to sprout in my own mind. Had Charlie, in a moment of childish defiance or even accident, done something that led to this? The idea felt monstrous, but the intensity of Zoe's hatred was something I had learned to never underestimate. The drive to the emergency vet was a blur of anxiety. Frank lay on a blanket in the back seat, his breaths growing shallower. Charlie sat beside him, his hand resting tentatively on the dog's head, murmuring reassurances I knew Frank couldn't understand. I kept replaying the scene in the backyard, searching for any detail I might have missed. The hot dog had been plain, grilled, nothing out of the ordinary. At the vet's office, the air was thick with the sterile scent of disinfectant and the low hum of machinery. The vet, a kind-faced woman with tired eyes, examined Frank thoroughly. She felt his abdomen, listened to his heart, and peered down his throat with a small scope. "It appears," she said finally, her voice gentle, "that he's swallowed something that's lodged in his esophagus. It's causing obstruction and irritation. We'll need to sedate him and attempt to retrieve it, or, if that's not possible, surgically remove it." The word surgically sent a fresh wave of panic through me. As they wheeled Frank away, Charlie's lower lip trembled. I put an arm around his shoulders, pulling him close. "He'll be okay, honey. He's strong." While Frank was in surgery, I sat with Mark and Charlie in the sterile waiting room, the silence amplifying my worst fears. Zoe's words, her subtle jabs about my lack of vigilance when it came to Charlie's well-being, echoed in my mind. She'd been at our house last week, ostensibly to drop off some baked goods. Had she seen an opportunity then? Tampered with something? The hot dogs, perhaps? It seemed far-fetched, but the alternative, that this was a random, horrific accident, felt equally terrifying. The surgery was successful, thankfully. The vet explained that they had removed an unusually large, dense object that had been lodged precariously. It wasn't a hot dog. It was a small, hard, almost crystalline mass. She couldn't identify it precisely, but she suggested it might have been something ingested that had solidified. "It could have caused a complete blockage," she'd said, shaking her head. He was very lucky. As we drove home, Frank now resting comfortably in his carrier, a profound sense of unease settled over me. The object wasn't a hot dog, but it had been in the hot dog. Or perhaps the hot dog had been used to deliver this foreign object. The crystal-like mass. It stirred a vague, disturbing memory. Zoe had been talking about natural remedies recently, about essential oils and holistic approaches to wellness. She'd been particularly interested in a new health guru who advocated consuming certain minerals in crystalline form for their supposed health benefits. It was all very vague, very woo-woo, but it had made an impression. The next morning, as I was cleaning out the garage, I stumbled upon a small, discarded pouch of what looked like finely ground, colorless crystals. It was tucked away behind some old paint cans, almost as if someone had tried to hide it. My blood ran cold. This was it. This was the object. But how had it gotten into Frank's hot dog? I remembered Zoe's visit. She'd brought a plate of cookies, but she'd also been hovering around the kitchen, asking questions about our meals, our routines. She'd even offered to help me pack Charlie's lunch for school the next day. At the time, I'd brushed it off as her peculiar way of trying to be helpful. But now, my mind raced. Zoe knew Frank loved hot dogs, especially the leftovers from the grill. She knew Charlie enjoyed them too. If she wanted to make Charlie sick, perhaps she'd thought a severe allergic reaction would be a good cover. Or maybe she'd intended for Charlie to interact with Frank in a way that would expose him to whatever she'd put in the dog's food, aiming to create a scenario where I would be blamed for negligence. The sheer maliciousness of the thought sent a tremor through me. Zoe, my husband's sister, wanting to destroy my family. It was the stuff of a twisted soap opera, but the icy dread in my gut told me it was real. I confronted Mark that evening, the pouch of crystals clutched in my hand. "Zoe did this," I said, my voice trembling. "She put this in Frank's hot dog. She was trying to make Charlie sick." Mark looked at the pouch, then at me, his expression a mixture of disbelief and concern. "April, are you sure? Zoe wouldn't do something like that." "Wouldn't she?" I countered, my voice rising. "She's been trying to break us up for years, Mark. She thinks I'm a bad mother, that I'm not good enough for you, and she sees Charlie as her way to get rid of me." Mark was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the pouch. He knew Zoe's manipulative tendencies, her subtle digs. He'd often dismissed them as her being eccentric, but the evidence I presented, coupled with Frank's near-fatal experience, seemed to shake his usual placidity. "We need to be careful, April," he said finally, his voice low. "We can't jump to conclusions. But I'll talk to her. I'll ask her about this." Mark's confrontation with Zoe was, as expected, a masterclass in deflection. She feigned shock and outrage, tearfully denying any involvement, blaming my own stress and paranoia for making such accusations. She even suggested that perhaps I had a hidden agenda, trying to frame her to cover up my own mistakes with Charlie. It was a twisted performance, and Mark, despite his initial resolve, seemed to be slowly swayed by her theatrical display of hurt innocence. But I knew the truth. The image of Frank gasping for breath, the foreign object in his throat, was burned into my mind. Zoe had crossed a line, a dangerous, unforgivable line. The next few weeks were a tense dance of suspicion and denial. Zoe continued her visits, her smiles plastered on, her eyes filled with a glint of something I now recognized as triumph. Or perhaps just anticipation. She would often offer Charlie snacks, her hand lingering on his shoulder, her gaze flicking towards me, as if to say, "See? I'm the caring aunt. You're the neglectful mother." I started being more vigilant, not just about what Charlie ate, but by extension, about what Frank ate. I kept a closer eye on Zoe when she visited, and I casually mentioned to Mark that perhaps it was time for him to set some firmer boundaries with his sister. The real turning point came unexpectedly, during a family barbecue at Mark's parents' house. Zoe, ever the eager helper, was assisting in the kitchen. I happened to walk in to grab a serving spoon and overheard her on the phone, her voice hushed, but not so much that I couldn't catch snippets. "Absolutely vital that he doesn't get too attached. Remember our plan, just a little longer, and then he'll be so relieved to be rid of her." My blood froze. Our plan? Rid of her? Was she talking about me? Was there someone else involved? Later that evening, after everyone had left, I found Zoe's phone, accidentally left behind on the kitchen counter. My heart hammered against my ribs as I picked it up. A quick scroll revealed her recent call log. The number she'd been talking to belonged to a woman I recognized with a sickening lurch, a former close friend of mine, someone who had always been subtly envious of my life. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Zoe wasn't working alone. She had an accomplice, someone who shared her venomous ambition, and their target wasn't just me, it was my entire family, my marriage, my son. The horror wasn't just in the attempted poisoning of our dog, but in the realization of a calculated long-term conspiracy. Zoe, with her warped perception of a sisterly duty, had enlisted another into her destructive crusade. And the question wasn't just why Zoe wanted me gone, but who she had partnered with, and what their ultimate goal truly was. The thought of that insidious plot, unfolding right under our noses, chilled me to the bone, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that this was far from over. The fight for my family had just begun. I knew I couldn't confront her directly. Mark would never believe me, and Zoe would only become more careful, more cunning. I needed proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof. The next few weeks were a blur of clandestine operations. I started secretly recording conversations, leaving my phone strategically placed whenever Zoe was around. I meticulously documented every instance of her presence in our home, noting the times, the circumstances, and my own gut feelings. I even began subtly checking the contents of the food she brought over, the medications in our medicine cabinet, anything that seemed out of place. Frank became my silent accomplice. I'd talk to him, pouring out my fears, my suspicions. He'd listen, his intelligent eyes fixed on my face, occasionally nudging my hand with his wet nose as if to offer comfort. He seemed to sense the shift too, growing more protective of Charlie and me, his growls directed not just at strangers, but at the subtle scent of Zoe clinging to the air after her visits. The real breakthrough came during a small family gathering a few weeks later. Mark's parents were visiting, and Zoe naturally was there, playing the role of the perfect doting aunt to Charlie. I'd been watching her, trying to appear nonchalant, while my mind raced. She'd brought a homemade casserole, a dish she knew Charlie loved. As she served it, she brushed past me, her hand brushing against mine. I felt a small object being pressed into my palm. Later, in the privacy of my bedroom, I examined the object. It was a tiny, clear plastic baggie, containing a few white pills. My heart hammered against my ribs. Were these the same pills from the vial? I knew I had to be careful. If I was caught, it would be damning. I decided on a risky move. I waited until Mark was asleep, then crept out to Frank's doghouse. He was awake, his ears perked at my approach. I carefully placed the baggie in a small waterproof container and buried it near his favorite digging spot under the old oak tree. Frank watched me, his tail giving a slow, questioning thump. "Guard this, boy," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Guard this with your life." The waiting was agonizing. Every day felt like an eternity. I continued my secret recordings, my meticulous notes, building a case against her, brick by painstaking brick. I felt like a spy in my own home, constantly on edge, waiting for the next move. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, it happened. Zoe was visiting, ostensibly to drop off a book she'd borrowed. Charlie was playing in the backyard, and Frank was lounging on the porch. Zoe approached me, a saccharine smile plastered on her face. "Charlie's looking a little peaky, April," she said, her eyes darting towards the backyard. "Are you sure you're giving him enough rest?" "He's fine, Zoe," I replied, my voice as steady as I could make it. As she turned to leave, she paused at the back door, her hand hovering over the handle. "Just be careful, April," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "There are people who can take children away if they think the parents aren't capable." That was it, the veiled threat, the implication that she would be the one to report me. The thought of it, the sheer audacity, sent a wave of ice through my veins. I didn't hesitate. I waited until Zoe was gone, then went straight to Frank. With trembling hands, I dug up the container. The pills were still there, pristine and terrifying. I also grabbed my journal, my phone filled with incriminating recordings, and the original vial I'd managed to retrieve from the trash after Zoe had carelessly tossed it. I drove directly to the police station. The lobby was sterile and impersonal, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotional turmoil I'd been living in. I approached the desk, my hands shaking, and placed my evidence on the counter. "I need to report something," I said, my voice cracking. "My sister-in-law. She's deliberately trying to make my son sick, and she wants me to lose custody of him." The officer at the desk, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes, looked at the contents of the baggie, then at my journal, then at me. Her expression shifted from professional detachment to one of growing concern. She listened patiently as I recounted the events, my voice steadying as I laid out the undeniable pattern of Zoe's behavior. The investigation was swift and surprisingly thorough. The pills were identified as a potent sedative, not something that should ever be administered without a doctor's prescription, especially not to a child. The recordings revealed Zoe's veiled threats and her attempts to manipulate situations. My journal provided a clear timeline of her actions and my suspicions. The day the police came to our house to question Zoe was a day of reckoning. Mark was home, his face pale and bewildered as he watched his sister being led away in handcuffs. The look in Zoe's eyes as she passed me, a mixture of shock, fury, and something akin to desperation, was a twisted sort of victory. The fallout was immense. Mark was reeling, his idealized image of his sister shattered. He looked at me differently now, with a dawning respect and a deep, unsettling regret. We had difficult conversations, tears were shed, and the foundation of our marriage, once cracked by suspicion, began to be rebuilt on a bedrock of truth. Charlie, thankfully, was healthy and safe. He never fully understood the drama that had unfolded, but he did notice the change in the atmosphere, the absence of his aunt, and the increased vigilance of his parents. Frank, my loyal companion, seemed to sense the shift, too. He resumed his happy-go-lucky ways, his tail wagging freely, his protective growls reserved for the occasional squirrel in the yard. But sometimes, when the wind rustled the leaves of the old oak tree, I saw him lift his head, listening, as if still guarding the secrets buried beneath its branches. The experience left scars, of course. The betrayal was deep, the fear had been real. But it also forged a new strength in me, a profound understanding of my own resilience. Zoe's attempt to destroy me had, in a twisted way, made me stronger. And in the quiet hum of the kitchen light, with Frank sleeping soundly at my feet and Charlie's laughter echoing from his room, I knew I had done what any mother would do. I had fought for my child, and I had won.